Hi, I'm Erica Ramirez, a WestfordCAT intern. Here today we have Dr. Joselyne Nkogo. She is a UMass Lowell criminal justice professor, and we also have Dr. Keith Mitchell, a UMass Lowell English professor with research in African American literature. So to start off, how long have you been studying criminal justice?
I would say I've been studying criminal justice issues for the past 10 years. Since I was a graduate student, I did my master's degree in criminal justice and then my PhD in criminal justice, and I've been teaching here for the past 1 year. So I've been interested in the issues of criminal justice for about 10 years, or maybe a little bit longer, but just 10 years for now.
Nice. And for you, how long have you been aware of these injustices?
Well, I've been teaching African American literature and ethnic American literature for about 30 years. And I've been aware of these injustices probably since I was 8 or 9 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the South, and so in the late 70s, early 80s. Mm-hmm. And so these issues have been central to my own life as well as to the literatures that I teach in my courses.
Nice. So jumping right in, would you say that mass incarceration, looking through Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow book, would you say that these injustices are now considered the new Jim Crow?
I think I would agree with Michelle Alexander, but I would like to point out that when we're talking about disproportionate representation of minority, what that simply means, it's not necessarily that there's more minorities in the prison system. It actually means there's more minorities compared to the number, right? For example, we have about 12% of the population is African American. And then in the prisons, we have over 40% of them being represented in the prison population. So yes, I would agree with Professor Michelle Alexander to some degree.
To an extent, I would agree with her also. There are over 2 million people in the prison population, in the prison system here. And the United States has the most incarcerated people in the world. So that says something really terrible about our system and what we are doing to our citizens.
Absolutely. And so going into the prisoners and whatnot and the injustices of having people of color in there that may be innocent or not found guilty, we can talk about Rodney Reid's case and how that may impact the injustices in America and the executions, the questions of executions in America.
So, I was thinking about this, and maybe for some people, Rodney Reid's case is unique, but unfortunately it's not. A few years ago, it was 2011, somebody called Troy Davis. He was executed in Atlanta after new evidence was found, and they had said that he had murdered a police officer. And somebody came up, a witness came up and said, no, actually I lied. Yet, Troy Davis was murdered. I think for me, that's a case that has stuck with me for a very long time because there was new evidence, the president was involved in a lot of things, and there was protests across the world. It was not just in the United States. So I would say that this is not new. This is something that's been part of the system for a while, where men of color and people of color are being executed. Sometimes, even when there's new evidence. So perhaps things will change, but the evidence that I have seen so far is this is nothing new. It's something that's been happening.
I would agree that the Rodney Reid case is nothing new. These kinds of injustices have been happening to Black Americans, particularly Black men, for centuries. Earlier in the United States history through lynchings, with Emmett Till and many others. James Byrd in the 1990s because of the Rodney King case. These kinds of brutalities directed towards African Americans, particularly Black men, is a new way of keeping Black men in their place and so quote unquote in their place. And also incarcerating them is a way of sort of structurally keeping Black men out of power. And not only just Black men, but we also have to think that there are also Black women in prison with their own unique challenges, and also other minority groups who are also in prison. The Reid case is particularly interesting to me because there has been so much new evidence introduced that exonerates him, or seemingly exonerates him. And Senator Ted Cruz has gotten involved in that, which is something that I would never have thought would occur, the Republican senator. And the governor has stayed his execution for now, so that I think it's going to go to the Supreme Court. But there's so much evidence, and so his defense was shoddy. That new evidence, and so it seems to me like he's being railroaded. And apparently there's some new evidence that came out, as we were talking earlier, about some women who have come forth to say that he had raped them also, but I have not been able to find any new information about that at all. So yeah.
I've been trying to look as well, and I couldn't find anything. Would you say this case is in some way different just because of how much media and exposure he has now, and how we can just trail and be able to go on social media and just post something about it and everyone sees it? Or is it just the same thing where they're still just not gonna, it's still gonna happen either way?
I think social media has been a really good thing, particularly in these kinds of cases, because it does get the word out to people who are interested in social justice, who are interested in reforming the criminal justice system. If this would have happened maybe 30 years ago, I don't think much would have come of it, and he would have been executed. Now that we have social media, so many different advocacy groups, and also just normal citizens who are working towards hopefully seeing justice being done in this case. So that's very important, social media.
And so, still talking about incarceration, what about the prisoners that are incarcerated for petty crimes like marijuana at the moment, and they are incarcerated in states that have legalized marijuana? Is there something being done about that?
There's nothing being done about that right now. From what I understand is that the federal government has certain laws that prohibit, the use of marijuana. So even though you have at the state level laws that are being passed that say, that the use of marijuana is legal, they still the federal statutes overrun or take precedent over the state statutes. So that's something that has to be worked out between the states and the federal government, because right now there are two separate sort of kinds of laws going on here at the same time. I'd imagine that eventually, if it's not worked out between the two forms of government, that it will be taken to the Supreme Court. I'm surprised it hasn't been done so yet, because this is, the marijuana is becoming less and less of a taboo thing, and it's also becoming a business.
Yeah.
And I think when you have money behind it, I can see these laws against it slowly but surely being eroded over time.
Yeah. And I would also think that, just when we think about the crack cocaine, and when you go back to that, who's being affected? The poor are being affected.
That's right.
So I think even with marijuana, we're going to start seeing the disparities. The poor are probably going to be targeted more than the wealthy, or the minority groups are probably going to be the ones that are suffering the consequences of this. Yet, as Professor Mitchell said, marijuana is becoming more and more, less and less of a taboo in the society. So people, the high and mighty, are using it.
Yes, that's right.
Probably the poor people are going to suffer the consequences of this. I'm not sure, I don't have any absolute statistics, but based on the crack cocaine and powder cocaine, there's a precedence here that probably this might happen again.
Mm-hmm.
History likes to repeat itself. So, transitioning into police brutality, do you think that police brutality against people of color is still happening at an alarming rate?
I happen to think absolutely yes, that is happening at an alarming rate, particularly for black men, but also for black women and minority men and other minority groups, men and women. And it is something that is, there's a cultural, not necessarily a cultural shift. I think you were saying earlier that there was sort of maybe less of this around the 90s or around that particular time, and now it's ratcheted up exponentially. and we see these cases in which, from Trayvon Martin to Sandra Bland and many, many other dozens. And maybe that these things were happening at an alarming rate, maybe in the 90s, but because of social media, now that has put the spotlight on these things happening for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't see that this is going to change that dramatically, not in my lifetime, but I hope it does, but I don't see it happening.
I would say that in the 90s, when community policing was implemented, and a lot of police officers, this was, they tried to make an effort to mend the relationships between the police, the citizens, the communities they serve. That helped, but I don't know what era of policing we're in right now, because there's been a lot of brutality, like Professor Mitchell said, against, unfortunately, mostly people of color. I was looking at the statistics, and I think the statistics say about 67 black males have been murdered in the past 2 years, and been brutally killed by the police just in the past 2 years. Some of them we've known about them, but some of them, unfortunately, we didn't hear a lot about them, because I think from Trayvon Martin, and we need to say that even though that was not a police officer, he was still representing
That's right.
enforcement. And then Michael Brown, those were very pivotal cases. But I think after that, there was a lot of excitement about those cases. But then perhaps there's a lot going on right now that's not even making it to social media, because there's a lot of them happening
That's true.
it doesn't gain traction, because by the time you report that, something else has happened, and it takes away the attention from this. We're moving to the next. So I think I would hope, because I studied police. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is how police can work with citizens to restore communities, and police legitimacy is one of the things that has been advocated, where if police treat citizens fairly, if the citizens they treat citizens with respect, then citizens are more likely to defer to their authority. Unfortunately, because of the history that we've had, when the police come to communities of color, they're bringing their history, and people of color most communities of color have not trusted the police, and because of this, it keeps fueling that distrust. So I am hoping that the police can take this, and the police are doing their best. Not every police officer is bad. We should say that. There are those that we need. Of course, they're the bad apples. But
And they get the most attention.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I'm encouraged that a lot of police departments are actually taking some of these things seriously, but that doesn't mean that brutality has gone down.
Right.
Yeah. So we're just hopeful that things will keep changing, and the new will not use same-size-fits-all policies for these communities, because we know that, for example, black males, they like respect. So if they're being approached without respect, then that will trigger them. And I think vice versa, just communities being educated as well as the police themselves being educated. It's not a one-way street. It has to be both. We cannot put the burden on the communities of color that you need to respect the police, yet the police are not respecting.
I always think it's really interesting to be a policeman of color.
Yes,
How that plays into and how that plays into what's going on with police brutality today, because they are a part of the community, right, and yet not a part of the community, and they're not trusted. They're not trusted any more than I think minority communities would trust white policemen. And so it's just really interesting to me. I was talking to my class about this a few weeks ago, about how if, like, the policemen who were at the protest, at some of these protests, how are they feeling about these minority communities protesting against police brutality, and yet they are a part of the system? And how do they relate to these minority communities as being a minority themselves and as being a police officer? I don't know if there's been any research done on that, but I think that would be a really interesting research project for someone to take up.
Yeah. And do you think that there will be any justice performed for these police brutality crimes? Do you think that police will finally be exposed, or do you think they'll just keep getting swept under the rug and just probation, paid administrative leave.
I want to be optimistic about this, that hopefully with time, and especially because citizens themselves are taking things, they're taking things seriously. There's advocacy groups that are coming up and all that. I think that with the organizing that's going on with the citizens themselves, and it's not just citizens of color, it's actually a lot of people that are noticing that this is not fair. So I believe that just like some injustices that were there in the 60s, they're still persistent, but we can say that awareness has come in and things are starting to change. But as they say, the wheels of justice are very, very slow. And I hope that with time we can see people actually receiving justice. But at the moment, that's not the case for the most part.
But I like your point about how these advocacy groups, within these advocacy groups, there is a coalition, not just of minority people,
Yes.
but all kinds of people who, it's like in the 1960s. I try to tell my classes that in the 1960s, in the civil rights movement, it wasn't just black people who were on the front lines protesting for African American civil rights. It was a coalition of all different kinds of groups who saw the injustices and what was happening to African Americans, and who fought and were on the front lines as much as African Americans were. And this, I think, the same thing as you were saying is going on here, and that needs to be, I think, that needs to be broadcast even more so.
Nice. And last question, just to end it. What about Kaepernick's stance and platform as a black man himself? How do we feel about his stance on it, and whether he did right, and him coming back now and almost about to be on an NFL team since 2016?
And I was very proud of Kaepernick for his stance in protesting police brutality. I think it's a case of, I think there are a couple of things going on. I think it's a case of freedom of speech, which does encompass the right to protest. But then there are laws, of course, and statutes about businesses or employers having the right to fire their employees. I think I'm surprised that this case didn't go to the Supreme Court and that they settled, and that Kaepernick settled, because I think he would have had a great case, right? He certainly had the right to protest, and I think the Supreme Court would have sided with him. I want to say I was shocked with the outrage by the outrage of many people across the country about his protest, but I'm not shocked at all, because it's just a strange idea, this idea that if you protest against an injustice, then that means you're unpatriotic, you're anti-American. But this country was founded on that, and people don't understand that. We were the so-called founding fathers were fighting against injustice against the English, against Great Britain, and then but they don't think that far back. People see this as some kind of protest against being an American, but I don't think it has anything to do with that at all. This is a country that was built on protest, and hopefully it'll continue.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to add? Anything at all?
I just want to say this is an important. Thank you for doing this interview with us. And this is an important project. I think more and more students, more and more people should become involved in these kinds of issues with police brutality in particular. And I know that there are a lot of students across the United States. A lot of times students don't think that they have much power, but they do. They have a lot more power than they think they do. And you don't have to do something like cure cancer in order to be a part of the system and a part of changing the system. Just writing a letter to your congressperson, showing up at a hearing, writing a letter of support for whatever issues that you are passionate about. I think that's very, very important.
And I think also, adding to that, that this generation, the younger, the college students and even the high school students, you guys have a tool. You have an important tool in your hand. And I think a lot of times people are not interested in what's going on around them. So if you see that and if you're passionate about something, rise up, rise to the occasion and do something about it. The Arab Spring started out of social media. Like nobody would have thought about Egypt, the Egyptian government being toppled and anything. And this is not even a developed country, this is a developing country. So when we think about social media, we can use it as a tool to, if you're talking about these injustices, once you get your facts right and you're passionate about something, we can use social media to bring about change. And everywhere that we go, we should be talking about these things because there's a lot of ignorance. There's a lot of ignorance out there. And that's why when I started, I was like, when we say that there's more people of color, there's a disproportionate amount of people of color in the criminal justice system. What we're actually saying is not that there's more black, brown people of color in prison than white people, because some people say, well, no, there's more white people in prison than black people. Yes, those are facts. However, disproportionality means that relative to their population, there's many of them being overrepresented in actually not just in the prison, in every stage of processing, from the first contact with the police to the end, which is sentencing. Throughout this, people of color are overrepresented. So I think this is important issues, and especially as we think about just the criminal justice system, and also as we think about immigration now being basically weaponized and being criminalized. So there's a lot going on, but there's hope. That's all I can say. There's hope with the social media and young people like you that are coming up and are passionate about something. So.
Great. Thank you so much for taking your time out of your day and doing this for me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank
So,
you.
thank you.